hello, and welcome to Things We Said Today, our weekly podcast about anything and everything to do with the Beatles, both as a group and as solo artists, past, present, things to come, whatever we can come up with. I'm Alan Kozin, the author of The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop, and Got That Something, How the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, and the former, now retired Beatles desk at the New York Times. And I have with me my three regular esteemed co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you know is the host of the syndicated radio show Every Little Thing, and who is now going to be doing his imitation of the late, great Scott Muni. He has a horrible cold. Ken, how are you doing besides having a horrible cold?
I'm doing okay, I think. I have to be ready to be on the radio tomorrow morning, so we may be listening to me a little bit less on the show today. Actually, I'm just putting that on, but this is not my best voice anyway.
People were going to think we were, sort of having someone else fake being you there for me. Okay, well, have some hot tea, and we will move on to Steve Marinucci, probably the world's only full-time Beatles reporter now. You can read his work in Billboard.com and Axis.com, which is AXS.com. And he is also the author of a book about the Monkees, Meet a Monkey, Davy Jones. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Alan. Hello, everyone. Thank you for those nice words, by the way.
Hey, anytime. And we have Al Sussman, the executive editor of Beatle Fan magazine and the author of the book Changing Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation. Hello, Al.
Hi, Alan. Hello there, everybody.
And we have a special guest this week, who is Brad Hunt, a contributing editor at Beatle Fan. I believe this month is the 30th anniversary of his very first piece in Beatle Fan, which makes us a little bit weighted towards Beatle Fan because I'm also a contributing editor, and Al, as you heard, is the executive editor. So welcome, Brad. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. One reason we have Brad today is that Brad does a lot of Beatle Fans book reviews, and today we're going to talk about books. But first, we have an item of Beatles news that you probably have all run into in the past few days, which is the death of Alexis Mardis, famously known as Magic Alex. Anyone broken up about that? Normally we wish that people rest in peace and stuff like that, but Alex has an awful lot to answer for, and as someone who has been sued by Magic Alex, or actually the New York Times was, because of a piece I wrote in which I mentioned just in passing, it was about the Maharishi, and I pointed out that one of the reasons that John and George left the ashram in 1968 when they went to study with the Maharishi was because Magic Alex went down there and began spreading rumors about the Maharishi making passes at women, and assuming that most readers wouldn't know who Magic Alex was, I had to identify him, so I identified him with the phrase charlatan and supposed inventor. Alex took exception to these things, all of them.
Really?
Also, part of the thesis of the piece was that, the Beatles actually, a lot of us think of the trip to the Maharishi as just sort of, some weird blip that they went through. But from my point of view, the cultural yield was huge because up through Pepper, which was their previous album before they went, they had been turning up in the studio with songs half written and finishing them there, which they had the luxury to do because, they were coining money for EMI and they could have as much studio time as they wanted. They went to Rishikesh and wrote songs, every time, whenever they weren't meditating, they were writing songs. They came home and they recorded 27 songs for the Esher demos. 21 of those got used on the White Album, which had 30 songs, plus Hey Jude and Revolution, so that's 32, plus Not Guilty and What a Shame, Mary Jane Had a Pain at the Party, or What's the New Mary Jane. That brings the total up to 34, plus the 6 remaining songs from the Esher demos that weren't used. That's 40 songs. There was no other time in the Beatles' history when, before going in to record an album, they had 40 songs, 40 new songs written, 27 of them demoed. So my feeling was that, whatever the trip was, even if it was just because they got away from London or whatever, but this trip and their involvement with the Maharishi, and John Lennon said specifically it wasn't just being away, it was the meditating, and this was after John broke with the Maharishi, he said that, was a big deal. So the question then was, why did they break with the Maharishi? And they broke with the Maharishi because of Alex. And I just mentioned that, really tongue-in-cheek, that, maybe if they hadn't broken with the Maharishi, they'd have done, a double album every 6 months. Obviously, it was a joke. But Alex actually sued us for that, too, because she interpreted it as an assertion that because of him, the Beatles became less creative. The lawsuit dragged on for about 2 years, cost the Times about $1.5 million at a time when it was laying off journalists. $1.5 million was roughly 15 New York Times salaries. And it was a completely frivolous lawsuit. And in the end, we settled with him. We didn't give him any money, but we let him affix a statement to my story, which is still there, and you can read it, in which he says at the very end, after giving his fantasy versions of how he didn't really build a recording studio for the Beatles and everything that everybody else says is untrue, he says, it said that the Beatles were more creative during the Maharishi period, but they did some of their most beloved recordings after they broke up, like Imagine, proving that he is a charlatan. So I'm terribly sorry. I'm not. I am not. That upset about Alex's passing, and I know that upsets people because you're supposed to be upset about anybody who dies. But yeah. He has a lot to answer for, as I say. Anyone have any comments about Magic Alex beyond all of that?
Well, actually, didn't Paul and Ringo leave India before John and George?
Yes. Ringo left early because of his stomach ailments, and also he didn't like the bugs. Paul had said that he would be going to India for a specific amount of time, and he stayed for that specific amount of time and then left. And what he left to do basically was essentially to set up Apple in his own image, as it were. And in a way, his leaving early set the stage for some other battles down the road. So that left John and George. And George did not believe Alex's assertions, but let himself get talked into leaving by John. John then went and wrote Sexy Sadie, which he originally called Maharishi, and George said to him, look, this is ridiculous. You can't do that. And talked him into changing it to Sexy Sadie, and apparently came up with the title. Yeah, but by the time Alex turned up, it was just John and George left. One of the things that Alex did, which he claims in his statement to the Times actually happened, but basically everybody in the Beatles compound either wrote or spoke about what happened, and they unanimously say that this didn't ever happen because the Beatles found the plan, John and George found the plan too creepy. What Alex did is he enlisted a woman who was in the ashram to go in and have a lesson with the Maharishi, and the Beatles were supposed to be waiting outside his compound, and at a certain point she would scream, regardless what the Maharishi was doing or not doing, and John and George would thereby catch Maharishi red-handed, making a pass at this woman. But they didn't go. They wouldn't go. They said, we're not going to do that. But they did sort of believe his story, that the Maharishi was doing these things. Mia Farrow wrote a book saying that he had hugged her in a way that she found sexual, but she clarified for, our lawyers went and interviewed a lot of these people too for the case, and she said, I was wrong about that. I looking back at it now, it was just, a hug, like a hug of greeting, and I just sort of overreacted. So yeah, we got a lot of interesting material, and in fact, I'm planning to do a book, which is going to be called, at least if I have anything to do with it, it's going to be called Charlatan: The Beatles, Magic Alex, the New York Times, and British libel law. Because I neglected to mention, he sued us in Britain. In Britain, there is this thing called libel tourism. Nobody in the case has to be British. Alex, at the time of the suit, lived in Greece. We, New York Times, was in the United States. No one in the suit was British or in Britain, okay? But you can charge anyone with libel in Britain and have a case there. And among the things that we found, and one of the reasons that we ended up settling with him, is that, for instance, a word, the definition of a word with which you supposedly libel someone is not admissible in court as part of your argument that you didn't libel him. So charlatan, according to the OED, not even an American dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, charlatan means someone who claims to have knowledge or ability that he doesn't have. I mean, they might as well have a picture of Alex there. But we weren't allowed to say that. He was asserting that charlatan implied some sort of criminality and criminal hucksterism. And a case actually could be made. But nevertheless, the other thing is that we had to prove that if Alex was spreading rumors in Rishikesh, we had to prove that he knew that they were untrue. We had to, in other words, prove that we knew what was in Alex's mind in 1968. And the philosophical impossibility of that is obvious. I can't prove what any of you guys are thinking right now, and we're sitting right, here. So, yeah, so it just was an impossible suit. If anyone wants to know about the legal system in Britain, and you haven't read Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, there is a fantastic section about British law there, and that was the 1700s, and it's just the same. I mean, what he says basically is, if I hath a mind to my neighbor's cow, all I need to do is prove that the cow is rightfully my neighbor's, and the court will award it to me. So, yeah. But it goes on at much greater and more hilarious length.
Yeah. Now, the story was published in the International Herald Tribune, and that gave him the opening to file the suit?
No, he sued the International Herald Tribune as well as the New York Times, and there was a newspaper in Greece that happened to include the story that day, and so he sued us through them in Greece as well. Yeah. It was basically a shakedown. What we didn't know was that Alex in recent decades had started a side career suing any newspaper that basically mentioned him and said, what his story with regard to the Beatles was, about what his inventions were, about his recording studio. Basically, anyone who mentioned the history was sued. And in England, they have a tradition of, basically having a budget line in their annual budgets for nuisance suits. And they paid him off and he went away. And so those things were mostly not reported. We didn't get to find out about them till it was too late. At the New York Times, they took the position that if we are correct and the facts seem to be on our side, and in the course of this case, I wrote, this was the whole story was maybe 1,200 words long. I ended up writing a 17,000-word court statement using every single quote by everybody who ever wrote or commented upon the Beatles and Magic Alex and Rishikesh and what happened. And, it's pretty unanimous. Now, that said, Mark Lewison, who we'll talk about in a while, because he has found so much in the Beatles story as he's researching it that is at odds with what we know, has been including, the idea that Magic Alex is a charlatan as one of the things he may or may not disprove when it comes down to it. I, frankly, am not sure how he's going to disprove that, but, maybe he can. We have Alex's very long statement, apart from what the Times published of his statement, along with my piece. I have a much longer version of that was his original court statement, which I'm sharing with Mark. If Mark wants to use any of that material, that's fine. In theory, my book should be out long before Volume 3 of his book. So, and so he may end up proving me totally wrong and proving everybody who's ever written about Alex totally wrong. That remains to be seen, but I'd be very, very surprised. And but, hey, Mark has surprised us already, so we shall see. So, I guess with no further ado, we should move on to the book section of the show. And speaking of Mark, I think what we decided to do was each pick 5 favorite Beatles books, or books that we consider the best, or
I guess
what was the definition?
I guess either or.
Yeah.
And it occurred to us, since we only have 5, and since Mark has written, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, at least, 5 books that are basically on everybody's must list, we're going to stipulate that, generally speaking, unless one or more of us wants to include Mark as one of our measly 5 books, we're going to stipulate in advance that Mark's books are obviously the standard reference. Tune In, the first volume of his trilogy about the Beatles, is revolutionary. It's changed what we know about a lot of that part of the Beatles story up to December 31st, 1962. Not least, it gave us an idea of how much there was to say about up to December 31st, 1962, when they'd only been signed for a couple of months. His Beatles recording sessions book, again, standard reference. The Complete Beatles Chronicle embodies a shorter, condensed version of the recording sessions book, plus information that was in his very first book, The Beatles Live, which is now out of print, and it's a collector's item. And I remember spending time in England looking for it, but apparently it hadn't come out yet. Everybody knew it was coming out, and everybody, even then knew that this was going to be something extraordinary. So, but I won't say any more about them, because I think possibly some of you may anyway, and I'll leave them to you. So we'll go around the proverbial virtual table, and we'll start with Brad as our visiting book reviewer.
Yeah. I came in with a list of 13 books, so tried to narrow it down to 5. It's a little hard to do. I'm going to throw a couple of honorable mentions in, and these are really in no particular order.
You could say it's you could say it's like 5 books in base 2 or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, Can't Buy Me Love from Jonathan Gould. Growing Up with the Beatles from Ron Schomburg. All Together Now from Wally Podrazik and Harry Castleman. Some Fun Tonight, the Chuck Gunderson look at the Beatles tours. The Beatles Forever from Nicholas Schaffner. And as an honorable mention, I'm going to put the Beatles Anthology.
Okay. And I guess we'll, as we go around, maybe you'll be able to mention more of your honorable mentions.
Right.
Why those?
Go ahead, Al.
No,
I was going to ask you why the 5 that you made your main list.
Well, I think Can't Buy Me Love, which came out around 10 years ago, it's very well written, first of all, and it looks at the Beatles from a musical point of view, a kind of biographical point of view, and also examines the wider culture that they came from. I remember reading it, and there's a passage in Can't Buy Me Love where he's talking about how kind of the foundation was set for the Beatles to their arrival in America, and about how the movie Tom Jones had won an Oscar the year before for Best Picture, and the kitchen sink realism of movies like Look Back in Anger and things like that. And it was just sort of, I remember just sort of having like just a eureka moment of like going, yes, I mean, that's really a good point and something that I never really thought about before, and no one had ever really explored before in any other Beatles book. And so that's why I would choose Can't Buy Me Love. Growing up with the Beatles was one of the first Beatles books I ever read. I got it for Christmas in 1976 when I was just about to turn 11. And for people who haven't read it, it's a kind of if you want to call it an every fan story about discovering the Beatles in 1964, and then Ron Schomburg graduated from high school in 1970, just as they were breaking up. And he talks about his life while, and also incorporates what's going on with the Beatles at that point, and how they were changing, and how he was changing. And the Prodragic Altogether Now, that's just a standard reference. And Harry and Wally, it's just a pioneering book, and it's a book that I have multiple copies of it, and I know my first copy ended up being held together by like duct tape by the time I was done with it, because it's such an indispensable reference book. And Some Fun Tonight, the Chuck Gunderson book, I mean, it's just a gem of a book. You have to just appreciate the shoe leather work he put into compiling this book. And if you have, it's out in paperback now, but if you have the original edition, which he self-published, and it's in hardback, the reproduction of the photos and the quality of the material he puts in, the contracts and things like that, it's just fantastic. And The Beatles Forever from Nicholas Schaffner, that's another one of the early Beatles books I read. It'll be 40 years ago that it was out this fall. And it's a beautiful piece of writing, and also a beautiful piece of writing for someone who was only 24 at that time. And I think it might have been one of the first books to kind of put the Beatles within a kind of broader cultural context. And also, for me, growing up in Toledo, Ohio at that point, where a Beatles convention was not up the street and record stores were kind of so-so, the collection of memorabilia that he has on display in that book is just, it was eye-opening. So, and then, of course, the Beatles anthology, kind of my honorable mention. I think in the review I wrote for Beatle Fan, I said something like, it's a Genesis Publications book that's actually kind of affordable. Yeah. That was my take on it. It was just
that's
a nice...
That's actually true, too, because Genesis did put it together.
Yeah. And that's one of those things where if I ever pick up the Beatles anthology now and I open it just to any random page, I really run the risk of sitting there for a half hour just kind of perusing it. Yeah, so those are my thoughts, at least, on the ones that I wrote down, and I'm sure we could talk about some of the other ones that I wrote later on, too.
Okay.
Yeah.
You may be able to thank me for the fact that if you open the anthology book, you can sit there for hours, because Brian Roylance, the founder of Genesis, came to New York and showed me some of his early mock-ups of things, of what the anthology book was going to be. And basically it was a lot of pictures and large, short quotes in large type. And it was like a lot of Genesis books now, where it's largely graphics. That became what they specialized in a certain way. And I said, Brian, my favorite books of yours are Derek Taylor's 50 Years Adrift. The early ones where they're very, very text heavy, and you've got all of the interviews with these guys. You've got to just publish a lot of that material in the book that we're not going to hear on the TV show where it's excerpted as sound bites.
Yeah.
And he said, really, you think so? And we went back and forth about it for a while. And then when I went over to England to do some reporting for the Times on the anthology, I spent some time with Derek Taylor, who obviously felt the same way. I mean, Derek was a writer, and he felt that a book should be text. And so I told him that. And at one point, when I was interviewing Neil Aspinall, Derek was in the room sitting at the table, and he said, "Oh, why don't you tell Neil what you told Brian about this?" And so I made, and obviously Derek was enlisting me to a cause that he was already fighting, so you can thank Derek too. And as it turned out, there ended up being an awful lot of text in it, so I feel a little responsible for some of the degree to which it's text can be.
Thank you, Alan.
Hey, anytime, I'm just doing my thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so who wants to be next? We'll continue giving Ken a rest for a bit and move on to Steve.
Okay. I kind of did a little, maybe a little different thing, is I tried to pick most of the books from the non-reference section. I tried. It was sure as heck wasn't easy. Because so many of the reference books are so good. And I'm going to mention several of them real quickly. Altogether now, of course, you have to mention that. I think I first bought the paperback, but I finally got a hardback version in the past few years, just because. But yeah, I have so many copies of that, it's ridiculous. But there's a couple of other reference books that should be mentioned that if you don't have, they're worth looking for. The books by Neville Stannard, starting with Long and Winding Road. I spent so much time in those books back, and they were not cheap because they were British, and those are really good. Sorry if I mash up this name completely. George Piper. His film and TV chronicles, both for the Beatles years and the solo years, those are also really good. And there's also the anthology of Beatle records, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and Always by Alex Bagaroff, and any of the Azing Maltmaker books, which are a Beatle geek. Those are just real geeky. But anyway, off the
geeky.
Yeah, I mean he's got every.
That's about 23 so far.
Has he got that many? I haven't seen any new ones. I haven't seen any new ones recently. I know I know he put out a bunch of them a few years ago. I don't know that he's still doing them. But non-reference books, I'd have to go with Longest Cocktail Ride by Richard Valello, which is one of the it's a great inside look at Apple, and it doesn't spare any. Doesn't it's the whole craziness of the whole thing. I'd agree with Brad about Beatles Forever. That it's such a joy to read. What a great writer he was. Ticket to Ride by Larry Kane, because of the inside view of the tour that he gives, and it wasn't unlike Hunter Davies' Beatles biography, which I kind of have to mention only because it was what it is. He was pretty honest with his portrayal of them. So that would be another one. Love Me Do by Michael Braun is another book. Unfortunately, some of these books now are just so expensive. Chuck Gunderson's is also great. I can't not mention Chuck. But some of these books now are getting so expensive, and that's really too bad, because some of these things are just great reading. And there is so many more that I didn't even mention. But yeah, there you go. As far as geek stuff goes, Maltmakers are as geeky as they get. With all the stuff he has pictured in the books, those are amazingly crazy. But I really like the George Piper books. I've referred to those often in my work. So there we go.
Yeah, Love Me Do. I never even found a copy of that till I went to England for the first time in 1989.
Really?
I think it was first published here in 1995. around the time of the anthology, and it's out of print again.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. It's available on Kindle, I think, but if you want to find an actual physical copy, it'll cost you a few bucks.
Is it on Kindle? I didn't know it was on Kindle.
I think it might be. I looked on Amazon, and
okay.
I think it is.
Okay, that's news. That's news to me.
It was originally published in England in like 1964, though, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And it's an incredible book because it captures the Beatles in a very candid way before they hit it big. They're really about to come to the United States. In fact, did you accompany them to the United States?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we get a bit of reporting on that, but they were not yet the Beatles as we know them in a way.
Let me mention one more book. Of all the books that analyzed their music, I have to, and I'm not saying it because you're here in the room, Alan, but your book, and also I have to be honest, he thanks me in the book, so I have to say that too. But your analysis versus some of the others is much better than the others that are out there. So there you go.
Shots.
There you go. I'm done.
When Alan's book is actually on my extended list here, and I think Alan's book came out about a year after a book called Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald, which I think is grossly overrated. And I think Alan's book provided much better analysis than that book. So yeah.
Yeah, and
so,
there's another one too.
I enjoyed writing that book. I mean, it was like one of those things where it basically was sort of a brain dump of everything I've been thinking about for the last 10, 15 years before it, maybe more, 95, maybe 30 years. And the problem with it was that I also had that Japanese book of the transcriptions, which was the first most accurate bunch of transcriptions of Beatles tunes in musical notation and tablature. And so as I got to something I was writing about, I'd pick up a guitar and I'd open the book and say, let's see what this feels like, because they would use in most cases the actual chord voicings the Beatles were using. I mean, anyone who plays knows there are a million different ways to play a chord on the guitar, and so they were giving you what I guess they determined was the actual voicings, and they felt really good to play. Even some of the usual chord progressions, you're saying, oh, now I understand how that works. And I would then say, let's do the next one. And it wasn't getting any writing done. I was just sitting there playing the stuff. So that was, that became a little time consuming. But I just wanted to know what the stuff felt like from the inside. And I mean, as a kid in a band, we just took what we could off the records and didn't really necessarily think about the way they were doing it. This book sort of snuck a mini review of that book in right there. You see. This was called The Beatles Scores. Anyway, so Ken, should we go on to you, or
sure?
Okay,
why not? But again, I caution my listeners: I'm not in full voice here, so please forgive me. And hopefully I'll be at least at 50%. But my top 5 here, I had to give 2 of Mark Lewison's books equal treatment and counted as one. Tune In All These Years, and also The Complete Beatles Chronicle. And even though Mark Lewison really became a name, what put him on the map really was the Beatles recording sessions. The work that he did on the Beatles Live before that was extraordinary, and all the research that he did. And like you were saying, Alan, the Complete Beatles Chronicle combines the work of the Beatles Live and the Beatles recording sessions, but it goes beyond that. Because it also includes the BBC performances, all the interviews that they did for radio and for television. They have an index in the back with all their songs and all the BBC performances, too. It really is everything day by day of what they did. It's as complete as you could get. So, if you don't have the Beatles Live and you don't have the Beatles recording sessions, it's all covered right there in one book.
Ken, tell me, and Alan, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but isn't there information in recording sessions that's not in Chronicles?
Yeah, because it's a bit condensed.
Right. See, because if I was going to choose one of Lewison's books, it would be Recording Sessions. That's me.
The Chronicle stuff has, as Ken says, the live stuff and the TV and radio stuff. So
right.
It's a trade-off. Obviously, you need them both.
Right.
Yeah, and all their concerts, too.
Mm-hmm.
So, I also put in there Many Years From Now from Barry Miles. And the reason why I put that in is because, you know, many of us love when John talked about all the Beatles songs and some of his solo stuff in Playboy, and they wish that Paul had done the same. Well, he did it in this book. All his memories of writing the songs that he did in the Beatles or the songs that he co-wrote with John are in this book. So if you want some kind of document of any kind of Paul's side of the story, it's all in there. So I use this book a lot as a reference, and it's always interesting to compare what John said and what Paul said about the Lennon-McCartney songs. And very often they didn't agree as to how much each one contributed. But it's interesting to hear Paul's perspective. And I also like this book a lot because Paul gives credit to the other Beatles on certain songs that we might not have known about. So it's a much more balanced book. It's not just all about him and what he contributed.
Mm-hmm.
He likes to give credit to the others, you know? Also, I have to mention 8 Arms to Hold You by Chip Mattinger and Mark Easter. As far as a reference book on the solo Beatles, that's as good as you can get. Yeah. My only regret is that it only goes up to 2000.
Right.
But there's so much information about every single song from the solo careers of the Beatles. It was all collected and put together in this one book. And there's even information about all the bootlegs. You know, if there's different versions of different songs, it's there in that book. There's even a whole index of everything from the Lost Lennon tapes in this book. So it's really, it's complete. It tells you where you'll find every version of every solo song. And if it's on a bootleg, it says the name of the bootleg. You know, if it was on Paul McCartney's Ubu Jubu radio series, it's in there. So it was very, very complete as far as documenting all the solo music through 2000. I really wish it would be updated, although we know from what Chip and Alan have said that the two of them are working together on a book on Paul, which we're looking forward to.
And Chip is working on one on Lennon, and part of which is out.
And yes, right.
And it's on my list.
Yep. Also, I have to say, and it's really tough to pick, you got to put Bruce Spicer in there somewhere.
Sure. Yes.
You know, which one's the best? How can you pick? I guess maybe the Beatles on Capitol Records, Volumes 1 and 2. The thing I like about Bruce's work is that it's so thorough. And he's got photos of everything, album covers, single sleeves, all of that. You know, he really does a fine job on all of his books. It's kind of tough to say this one's the best. And I have to put Some Fun Tonight in there as well, because I love books that are thorough, and everything you'd ever want to know about every North American date from the Beatles is in there. You know, that may be too much information for some people, but it all comes down to the attendance, what hotel they stayed in, what airport they landed in, you know, how much security was involved in each show, what the cost was for security. You know, if you're into all that stuff, and lots of stories as well, including all the opening acts for the Beatles from 64 through 66. Chuck Gunderson's book is really, it's just wonderful. You can't get any better than that. For that, if you really want to zero in on that part of Beatle history.
I'm wondering if we should have done separate lists on reference and non-reference books, because you really run into a problem there trying to separate the two. There are so many great reference books. I mean, 8 Arms is one that and I forgot to mention Doug Sulpy, who's done some fantastic work. And I mean, I'm kicking myself now because I mean, his books have been go-to books for decades now. And so I mean, it's really hard, but in any event.
It is. Well, maybe next year we'll do a two-part.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
So I'll take my turn now. Sadly, many of my books have been chosen, and this is the problem with going last. And the other thing is,
wait a minute, you forgot Al.
Give us Billy Preston.
Oh, hell, really? Damn. Okay.
Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I won't go now. It will be the executive editor for Beatle Fan. Oh.
That was good.
Sorry.
No problem. No problem. With my list, I pretty much went old school. What a surprise, right?
Mm-hmm.
First one would be "Love Me Do" by Michael Braun, which Brad mentioned, which came out here in America actually in a magazine form called "The Real True Beatles," and that's how I first read it. And then I was able to get a copy of the actual book some years later by a friend who was working with me at ASCAP, and it's really the first kind of really honest look at what the Beatles were actually really like during, as Brad said, a particularly crucial period in their development in the British tour in the fall of '63, and then the trip to Paris, and then the trip to America. And it's, because the other books that were coming out at that time were basically just, teen magazine type of things. Or even the Billy Shepherd book, which was taken mainly from the very sanitized history of the Beatles that had been in the early Beatles monthlies. Kind of an expanded version of that. So this was really the first kind of relatively honest look at what the Beatles themselves were really like at a particularly crucial moment in their history. The next one is from 1975, and it's The Beatles: An Illustrated Record by Roy Carr and Tony Tyler, which was kind of the first book that took a historical chronological look at their recordings and did it in a somewhat more critical, somewhat more I don't want to say cynical, but certainly a more objective viewpoint than this is great and this is great and this is great and this is great. They actually and this is at a time when before Beatle Fan, before there was all that much objective sort of journalism about the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, it's a really striking book. They did an update of it in 1981, but it's a really good book. And at roughly the same time, there came the first volume of the 3 Harry Castleman, Wally Petrazik books all together now, which was really the first detailed discography of the Beatles. There had been other discographies, that could be spread over 3 or 4 pages of a pamphlet, but this was the first one that really went into detail, not only of all the releases in England and in the U.S., but also Apple Records and various and sundry other things. And of course, the 2 volumes after that, the Beatles Again and the End of the Beatles, are also, if you can find them, are really indispensable. My copy of the paperback version of All Together Now isn't even a book anymore. I probably would need to get rubber bands together to keep them together. There's no binding. That's how much, and as Brad was saying before, that's how much they've been used.
That's funny. Mine's exactly the same way. It's right beside my bed with rubber band around it.
Do any of you guys have Things We Said Today? Funny name for it. Things We Said Today. The one that goes through the lyrics and how many times they use certain words and all that.
Yeah, I have that.
That's a fascinating book. I think that's a great book.
Was that one of the Pierian Press books?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
As was All Together Now.
Right.
Right.
That was the first one, as a matter of fact.
Right. But
Yeah.
and but yeah, Things We Said Today is a great. You can still get all of them. I think. Some of them are more expensive than others. Not sure Not sure how much All Together Now goes for, but the one I got was As I Write This Letter. I got that a couple of years ago, which was relatively cheap. I was surprised. I didn't pay very much for that. But but
you know what was also great about All Together Now was the most fascinating thing to me were all the side projects of what the Beatles did for other people.
Exactly.
So I turn a page and I would see the song 4th of July by John Christie, written by Paul and Linda McCartney, and I would say, what is that? I would never have even known about some of these songs that the other Beatles wrote for other people or produced for other people or played on for other people had it not been for All Together Now.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I remember I spent many hours with that.
It's also fascinating to look at the charts, the Billboard and Melody Maker charts that are in All Together Now.
Yeah.
You find out things like See Liebtig was at number 97, while She Loves You was at number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They also have the original artists behind the songs the Beatles covered, group and solo, and also when they came out, was it a single? What year did it come out? What was the B-side of the original recordings of the songs that the Beatles put out? That took a lot of work, especially at that time.
Especially at that time, because there really had never been a book like that before. Like I said, the only Beatles discographies there had been would be, there would be like, a 5 or 6 page pamphlet that might be sold at a Beatle Fest or something. This was the first big, Beatles reference book.
Right.
The other thing about it, in a way, and I'm pretty sure I could guess that Al probably feels the same way, and maybe you, but when I first saw that book as a Beatles collector geek, it really kind of made me think, wow, there were more of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Very true.
That it was an important. It was kind of like an important validation as well. Someone felt also that this stuff was important, and someone felt it was important enough to publish it.
In fact, I don't know if you had the same feeling. I don't know how you obtained your first copy, Alan. I ordered mine through the mail, I think from Pierian Press, and I was practically counting the days until this book arrived in the mail. That's how much I was anticipating it. So you're very right that it really did kind of validate being a hardcore fan.
Absolutely crazy in those days,
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And also, there were probably a lot of Americans that didn't know the British releases. Just to see the British albums, and also EPs. They probably never even knew that there were EPs in England.
Because it had only been maybe a couple of years before that we had started getting, to any great extent, imports of the British Beatles albums, and that may only have been on the East Coast through Gem Records. I don't know about the rest of the country. I don't know about where
somewhere in Ohio, and that would have been mid-70s or so.
Okay, yeah. This is like as early as like 72. I remember at Sam Goody, we had them, but by the mid 70s, like you say, Ken, a lot of people really didn't really know the differences at all. So definitely All Together Now really was an eye opener in that respect as well.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Next on my list is The Beatles Forever by Nicholas Schaffner. Which is just, as Brad said, it's just a wonderfully written book. Nick was such a talented writer, and it's such a tragedy that he died at such a young age. We at Beatle Fan, can never be objective at all about Nick, because he was very much a part of the early years of the magazine. And but it was, along with being so beautifully written, it was also written from the point of view of an American fan. Which most of the other books, the kind of narrative books like the Beatles, an Illustrated Record, were written by Englishmen and written from the English standpoint. This was written by a young American fan, and so it told the the story of the Beatles beautifully in a narrative, but also told it from the perspective of the American fans. So that made it particularly special. And he later did kind of a children's version of that book called The Boys from Liverpool. Yes, exactly. And that's one that if you want to, if you have a child and you want to give them an idea of the the Beatles story, that's a very good place to start. But the Beatles Forever is great. And I did sneak in one Mark Lewison book, because the Beatles recording sessions the release of that was an absolute event, with a capital E. And there weren't a whole lot of Beatles, at least positive Beatles events in the 80s. And I remember this was at a Beatle Fest in probably 86 or 87. Mark was a guest there after the Beatles Live had been released. And we were talking with him, and he mentioned the fact that he had been given permission to go into the EMI tape library and basically write an authorized book on the complete Beatles recording sessions. And you could almost see our jaws drop to the ground. And when that book came out in, I guess it was early. I think it was early '89.
It was October of 1988.
Oh, it was '88.
Yeah.
Okay, I knew it was either late '88 or early '89. And that was definitely it was an absolute event with a capital E.
What also makes that whole experience memorable is that the first volume of the Ultra Rare Tracks bootleg came out at roughly the same time.
Exactly the same time.
Yeah.
Because I remember I went down to Atlanta to visit Bill King, the publisher of Beatle Fan, and his son Bill at that time was 3 years old. And they had gotten Ultra Rare Tracks, both of the two volumes. And I remember one had a green cover and one had a red cover. And 3-year-old Bill would be requesting, in the car, saying, "Play green Beatles, Daddy."
Oh, wow. We got to do a whole show on the coming of those albums. I mean, those were just a huge monumental thing.
Yeah, exactly. And and people, of course, there were people suspecting that it was Mark.
Right. Oh yeah, he fought that.
And as it turned out, it wasn't. But there were those suspicions. And but the book itself is just it's another one of those books that you just go to time after time after time after time to for information. And,
I still do. I still do for my radio work. Yep.
Yep, me too. And then for an honorable mention, I would basically say the entire Bruce Spicer catalog. Because all of those books are absolutely magnificent. If there's maybe one to get that's maybe more affordable than some of the others. Of course, now you can get I think the two Capitol books and the VJ book much less expensively now as digital versions.
Right.
But also the one that's still available as a hard copy is The Beatles Are Coming.
Right.
Which is, which I've said in Changing Times is the absolute, that is the book about the breakthrough of the Beatles in America. Mm-hmm. Plus the fact that it reads so well because Bruce is such a talented writer. And of course, it was Bruce who was able to unearth that, that very important nugget that the Alexander Kendrick report on CBS News aired the morning of November 22nd, 1963, and was scheduled to run on the CBS Evening News of Walter Cronkite that night before the Fates intervened. Mm-hmm. And that's a very important piece of information. But all of Bruce's books are worth you're worth your interest, definitely. And like I said, the digital books, and actually with the digital books, you can do things now with them, and there's more information in there that's not the original book.
He automatically updates them too.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So that's my list.
Yep.
Now, Alan.
Can I go?
All right. Time's up. Story hour in. All right. Go ahead, Alan.
Okay, so for me, it was a big problem because, apart from that, I knew that most of my books would be, discussed by everyone else. The thing is that actually a lot of these guys are my pals. Steve Marinucci published a picture on, on Facebook and on one of his other lines of my wedding where, my incredible wife is in the middle and surrounded by, me and Lewis and Richard Buskin and Jonathan Gould and Wally Podrazik and Bill King. And it was sort of like, Beatles, and she in fact had made a video to show at the wedding of like everybody's books, with Paperback Writer as the soundtrack. So, I don't, on one hand, I wish I could include all the books that I really would like on the list, but, there are just certain things like, and what I choose today might not be what I choose tomorrow. And, because there are a lot of great books out there. I mean, the Beatles bookshelf, or in my case, the Beatles wall of books is an incredible thing. People have done a lot of good pioneering work. So, I looked at a lot of things, and a lot of you chose things that were like near and dear from the early years of collecting, like Nick Schaffner and Wally's books, which are of course musts. And I was very tempted also to include Hunter Davies, because even though it's been sort of expurgated by the Beatles themselves, who apparently went through it and ripped out whole sections. Nevertheless, that was the first really serious Beatles biography. There was two, but so early. This is 1968.
I mentioned it a little bit too, yeah.
Yeah, and he has, eyewitness accounts of them working on, basically writing with a little help from my friends and other things, and and that's important stuff. So I've always had a soft spot for Hunter Davies, so I'll include him and get rid of one of the ones that you guys have already mentioned.
Yeah.
And then also, Walter Everett's two books, The Beatles as Musicians.
Yeah.
Okay.
Since I'm often identified when you guys do the intros as the group musicologist, I guess I should, in deference to my musicological colleague, Walter's books are for people who understand, how music works using the terminology of music theory and all that. So they're not light reads, but, here's the thing. Walter, and before him to some extent, Tim Riley, who was at my wedding too, and Terence O'Grady. I don't know if you guys have his book. These were the first books that really looked in detail, and I guess Wilfred Mellors, but Wilfred Mellors Twilight of the Gods was written, by someone who liked the Beatles, but somehow didn't quite understand the ethos, the thing about it. He kind of could analyze them as tunes, but he didn't quite get it. Terence O'Grady got it a lot more, and Tim, but Walter's books were the first books where you've got, okay, here is a really serious musicologist who could take apart, a Bach cantata or a Mahler symphony or a Stockhausen and give, a paper that the Musicological Society of America would accept and, listen to seriously, but who absolutely knew what was going on in Beatles records and who was doing what and why and what it was supposed to mean and what the outtakes were. He's got it all. And if you have musical training and want to read that level of analysis, Walter Everett's books are the ones to get. There are 2 volumes. I think one goes up through Rubber Soul and the other one goes through from there to Abbey Road. The Beatles as musicians. Let's see. I had also included, I thought about Bruce Spicer and his many books because they are really standard references, and also the one I chose was on Al's special extra mention list. The Beatles Are Coming. That really, get to the bottom of a lot of what went on in America and the marketing of the Beatles as they were coming here. It's very important. And when I was working on You Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, Bruce's book was invaluable. I mean, it had a lot of, it answered a lot of questions for me and pointed me in right directions as well. Here's one that hasn't been mentioned. Recording the Beatles by Ian and Brian.
Yes.
So they don't do all the Beatles songs the way Mark Lewison did in his recording sessions, but the ones they did go into incredible depth about how they did them, and the first section of the book details every single piece of EMI equipment that could be found in the Abbey Road studios when the Beatles were there and how they used them. So that is a remarkable resource. They published it themselves. They started an imprint called Curve Bender Books to do it. I think, these days self-publication in the Beatles world is a major, major thing. When people were growing up, self-publication was kind of looked at, a bit askance. It's like, okay, it's vanity press, right? But with the Beatles in particular, and it may be the case in other fields too, but with the Beatles, self-publication has given people the ability to control the quality of the printing and the paper and the pictures and have complete editorial control. And some really, really important stuff has come out that way. Bruce's books are self-published. Recording the Beatles, Chuck Gunderson's Some Fun Night, which is also on my list, but I may kick it off since it's been on everybody else's list. But, see, these things are not vanity publications. These things are labors of love, and they're immensely valuable to all of us who spend a lot of time with this. I wanted to include Many Years From Now as well, and I guess because so far only Ken did, so that's only one of the 5 of us. 10 years from now is, as close as Paul's done to an autobiography. And, he talks at great length about an awful lot of stuff. Beatles era, really, not much solo stuff, which, there should be a Many Years From Now part 2.
I'll help him with that.
Yeah. If you want to know not just about the songs, but for instance, if you want to know exactly what Paul McCartney thought of, say, Magic Alex, it's in that book. Yeah. Lennonology, the first installment of Chip Mattinger, and we always say Chip, but it's also Chip and Scott Riley. The 2 of them are the co-authors of that. It's the first volume is basically a very, very detailed annotated diary of John's career. I mean, almost day by day tells you what he was doing, and I mean, the next parts are going to be the discography parts, which will be really, really interesting. But this, if you want to know what and when and where something was recorded and what John was doing around it. Lemonology, the first volume of Strange Days, maybe Strange Days Indeed. Anyway, the first volume is something to look for. Again, that is a self-published thing, and I guess I should, as a disclaimer, say that Chip is also in the team that is doing the McCartney Legacy, which I'm doing with Chip and Adrian Sinclair, which will be the McCartney version of this. So let's see. I know I managed to sneak in more than 5 there, so I should call it a day. But all of these books that you guys have mentioned have been really important. And Lewison's recording sessions, for instance, that in a way was the serious start of the Beatles desk at the New York Times, because although I had done a lot of Beatles writing before then, had reviewed the CDs, for instance, the first CDs, the 87 ones.
Oh, right.
The editors really took it seriously after the piece about Mark's book, which was also, the first time I got to talk to Mark. And so, and that became a great friendship. And, it was just a thrill to read the book and then, talk to him about how he did it. But the early edition of that story came out with a photo of Ringo, Paul, and George Martin at the console, pushing the faders. And the photo editor who wrote the caption wrote, "Paul and Ringo with an unidentified producer." At Abbey Road. And one of our copy editors saw it when the first edition came out and immediately fixed it. So for most of the country, it was fixed, but the first edition goes out and goes, far and wide. And we got sacks of mail from people blaming me. I'd get these letters saying, "You turkey, you can't identify George Martin." And I'm thinking, come on, you read the piece. Don't you think I can identify George Martin? And I went to the photo editor, and I said, "Why? How is it possible you did this?" And he said to me, "Well, in my opinion, music ended in 1827. Now, like me, are also classical music critics, know that 1827 is the year that Beethoven died." But I said to him, "Excuse me, but that is my determination to make. Yours is to identify people in captions."
Wow.
But, because we got so much mail complaining about that caption, suddenly the culture editor began coming to me like every 3 weeks saying, "So what's going on with the Beatles?" And it's like, by now it's 1988, 89. And I'm saying, they broke up in 1970. I'm not sure what I can do for you this week, but it was great, having the encouragement to keep finding new Beatles stories, which is what Steve does today, basically on a daily basis. But
thank you. Let me ask one more question. I've been going through Amazon while we've been talking, and anybody have anything to say about Ellery King's bootleg books? Remember those?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Those are,
I remember them vaguely,
Mm-hmm.
but
Oh, they're really good. Yeah.
I spent a lot of time with those. I mean, those were Geek Central, for bootleg information. Doug's too, but I mean, those were other really good books, and they're still out there. But they're a little on the expensive side now. They're not cheap anymore.
I think he did kind of an annotated sort of companion to the Lost Lennon tapes, if I remember correctly.
He did. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Does anyone else remember a Purian Press book that came out in the early 80s called You Can't Do That?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Charles Reinhardt.
Yeah, that was a great
Yes.
bootleg book.
Yeah.
Charles was the guy who ran the company, wasn't he?
I think so.
Yes, he was.
I'm Schultheis.
Oh no, you're right. That's right too.
Yeah.
Schultheis did a book, and I can't remember which one it is.
It was called A Day in the Life, but unfortunately, he put in there stuff that wasn't actually accurate, plus stuff from paperback writer, the Mark Schipper book, and other stuff. So it wasn't all that reliable as a reference.
It was fun, though. I remember.
It was definitely a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Paperback Writer is a book I haven't read in years, but it is quite funny.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of fan fiction, but that one book, the very first fan fiction Beatles book, that was just great.
Yeah. Do we have any thoughts on the worst Beatles books by any chance?
Well, I know one author we can mention that will probably get us sued, but
so don't mention.
I don't think we should mention it.
Does his last name begin with a G?
Yes.
Yeah.
Who?
Okay.
Who?
Goldman.
Yeah, Goldman. Oh God, that's a horrible.
No, that's not who I was thinking.
No, I know who you're thinking of. I know who you're thinking of. As far as we've talked about Goldman before, and one thing, Alan, I remember you said previously was that he actually had some stuff in there that nobody else did. Goldman? Yeah, didn't he?
Yeah, you mean like true stuff?
Well, I thought that's what you said.
I know that he was the first one to report that the Beatles' early records came out on 78th.
Okay.
And that John's first song was called "Ain't It a Shame," the first song he learned.
Okay.
That's Domino, who, although I think he said Fats Waller. Wendy Carlos was a Japanese composer.
Never mind. My memory failed me. Okay, forget it.
To me, that's the most useless of Beatles books. But hey.
And the shame is that it was so probably read by so many people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't write it for my wedding.
There's a lot of Beatle books that's loaded with inaccuracies. Especially a lot of the trivia books. So
Well, even some of the narrative ones, the Bob Spitz book is probably one that comes to mind, which is rife with inaccuracies.
Can I mention a few more honorable mentions that we haven't brought up?
Why not?
Okay, John Lennon in My Life from Pete Shotton.
Oh yeah.
I always enjoyed that book, and when you think about it, outside of the Beatles or anybody that worked with John in a creative capacity, who was closer to John throughout his childhood years than Pete Shotton?
Right.
And, he really presented him in a way that I think was careful, it was tactful, but it was truthful. And, there's the darker side of John that was shown in the book, too. But, I felt that it was very accurate and believable. The David Bedford books I like, Liddy Pool and Fab 104.
Liddy Pool especially is a great book. But yeah.
I especially love Ken Sharp's book, Starting Over. Anything you'd ever want to know about the Double Fantasy Sessions from all the people who participated, from the musicians to even the photographer that was hired, and the engineers, and even quotes from John and Yoko. It's all there in the book. So, yeah. I Need Mine, George, I would definitely put in there because, like we were talking about John, talking about all of his Beatles songs and Playboy and Paul and many years from now, George talked about all of his songs, well, most of them, through 1979 in that book. So it's you got to have that one.
There's a new expanded edition coming out.
Right.
I can't wait for that. And then there's John Lennon. Come Together. John Lennon in His Own Time. That was so detailed about the whole FBI investigation on him. And that paved the way for other things like the U.S. versus John Lennon movie. The Robert Rodriguez books I like. Kid O'Toole's book, of course, Songs We Were Singing. And also Luca Perassi, the Paul McCartney recording sessions book. His music from 1969 through 2013. Everything you'd want to know about all those songs, it's in there. The ones that he wrote, actually.
I think none of us, I'm surprised, mentioned the Kevin Howlett BBC book.
Oh,
Which was surprising. And I mean, that's another really good book. I mean, you for reference, you can't get away from the detail in that book.
That's for sure.
What we really needed to do is each have a show where
Yeah.
we each have the whole show to talk about all the Beatles books that are important to us.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's just so many. But yeah. So.
Well, no one has mentioned communism, hypnotism, and the Beatles yet.
Oh yes, I do have that.
Yeah.
I have several of his books. They're a hoot. But you know
I don't even know that one.
It's weird about those books. Okay, David Nobel is one of these guys who writes books about, my parody version of his books are like, communism, the Beatles, and your daughter.
Yep.
They're basically alarmist books about how the Beatles are part of some, massive leftist conspiracy.
Alex Jones would have written it today had it been written today.
Yeah, he's probably still alive. I mean, I have a book that he did about Lennon that was, bit after Lennon died. But the interesting thing about David Nobel's books is his bibliographies. That guy has everything, I mean, it's very, very, very thorough. And, it gave me an idea I was at one point going to write, and may, who knows, still write a novel about these guys who basically are geek collectors who decide to do a heist of some major unreleased material. And they decide that they're going to practice on David Nobel because they realize by looking at his bibliography that although he's writing these alarmist anti-Beatles books, he actually has an incredible collection of Beatles research material. So I go to his house and steal the Beatles research material. And when they do, he catches them. And they say, well, we've decided that you actually, you don't really deserve to have all the stuff you have. And he thinks for a minute and he says, okay, come on. And he takes him into a room and he's got a, Paul McCartney stage suit from Shea, and he's got instruments, and he's got, he has an incredible collection. And it turns out that he's another geeky Beatles collector who has financed his collection by writing these books and selling them to evangelicals.
Wow. This
is fiction, folks. It's not, if I ever do that novel, you can read all about it. But, yeah, I mean, I was struck looking at his bibliographies. It's very, very thorough. So, yeah, David Nobel. Who'd have thought we'd be mentioning that guy?
Yeah, really.
That book, Communism, Hypnotism, and the Beatles, is actually on a list of books I would like to get my hands on at some point. I'd love to get 50 Years Adrift, too, the Derek Taylor Genesis Publications book. And it would be great if the widows of George and Derek would allow that book to come out in a trade form.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
One other important book that I'm surprised none of us mentioned was Jeff Emmerich's Here, There, and Everywhere.
Oh.
Yeah.
So there's another one that I'm not trying to, just...
And George Martin's books.
And George Martin's books, too. I mean, there's more. And, you're absolutely right about the 50 Years Adrift. I'd love to. And there is one, and I can't remember the name of it now, and I'm going to have to look it up here while we're sitting here, that was available... Oh, As Time Goes By, Derek Taylor.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Which actually you can get relatively cheaply. I'm looking here on Amazon now, and there's a paperback for like $8, which is really not bad at all.
It is a good book. And he also wrote a book about the Summer of Love.
Yes,
right.
It was 20 years ago today.
Right, but As Time Goes By is about Apple and the Beatles. I don't know. I don't think Summer of Love is not just about the Beatles, though. But As Time Goes By is really about the Beatles. Too.
It goes into his work at the Beach Boys and his work at Warner.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm. But really, The Drift is brilliant. That was the first Genesis book I ever got, and then got I Me Mine later, which came out first. But yeah, I mean, in fact, we should sort of nod to all the other Genesis books because they've done some incredible, especially and then once they branched into photography, they began, they put out books of Astrid stuff and Jürgen Vollmer and
the one from Ringo from last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
From Photographs.
They did too. They also did the
postcards book.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, postcards from the boys.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at. They did a book of Stuart Sutcliffe's paintings, and they have quite a lot. And and they've got the one coming out of the pictures from Japan that I wrote the intro to.
Yeah.
So I should also mention there are 2 other Curvebender books besides recording the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
They put out 2 books of Henry Grossman's Beatles photos, and Henry is an incredible guy who when Kennedy was assassinated, the New York Times front page had portraits of Kennedy and Johnson, and they were both by Henry, who at the time was in his 20s.
Mm-hmm.
He got an assignment to cover the Beatles and, early on, and went and shot a bunch of photos and became friends with them, friendly enough that they allowed him to shoot pictures with their families, which weren't generally allowed at the time. They tried to keep the families out of it, especially the kids. And he was given permission to publish some of those, and now there are more of them in Places I Remember, which is the second book. And the first one, Kaleidoscope Eyes, he was at a pepper session for one particular night when they were recording Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And it's a thick book. You see the session basically from beginning to end, and lots of detail, and they're just great books to have if you like photography.
Right. I have one minor complaint about Genesis is that most of the books are just
they're so expensive.
They're so expensive, and it would be really nice if they would put out popular versions of each of at least the Beatle books, so that everybody because it's really too bad. But
I understand. It's true. They really ought to. But the whole point of that press originally was that it was like artisanal bookmaking. Everything's handmade, and it's very carefully done, and that's the standard that they want, and that's expensive.
I get that. I mean, I could live without. I mean, if I'm going to pay that much less money, I'm obviously not going to get the signatures and all that. I just want to. I would like to read Derek Taylor's book. That's the point.
Yeah, that's true.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand what you mean, and I kind of wish they would do that too. I mean, they did it with I Me Mine, and the new I Me Mine's going to have a trade version too, and the expensive one obviously isn't going to be signed. So,
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess we should reluctantly wrap up.
Yeah.
We could keep going.
We really could. So, and this is without actually, I've done this, my part of it anyway, without actually looking at my bookshelf during the show. If we were to start looking at the books, it would be even worse.
I know. I didn't either. I didn't even bother to look. I just kind of went off of memory. So.
Okay. So you can contact us at Things We Said Today Radio Show at gmail.com. Send us emails, complaints, questions, ideas for shows, anything you want. We've been getting a lot of email lately, and at some point we'll try and catch up with some of those because people have been saying some really interesting things, and we'd like to acknowledge those, but keep them coming. You can follow us on Twitter with the @ Things We Said Fab. And we have a Facebook page, Things We Said Today Beatles Radio Fans. And we'll go around and just get contact information from everyone. Let's start with Brad. How do people get in touch with you if they want to?
Probably the best way to get in touch would be, I have a Facebook page as well, and my last name is spelled Hundt, so it's a little bit of an unusual spelling. But probably the best way to get in touch would be by email, which is bwhunt, Hundt, @yahoo.com.
Steve?
You can get me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I have a Facebook page with my name. I have a Facebook page or a Facebook Beatles news group called Beatles News and Commentary, and I also monitor you. If you post a note on the Things We Said Today Facebook page, it's likely that I'm going to answer it. Actually, we all might answer it, but yeah, that's where you can get me.
Okay, Al?
Facebook, Al Sussman, Twitter, @ASUSS49, or www.beatlefan.com for Beatle Fan Magazine. Also, but on a very quick plug, last week Alan Haber and I taped about a half-hour show which Alan calls Two Owls Talking Tunes, and which is going to be kind of an occasional thing. And we did a show on Sunshine Pop, both American and British. Just about a half hour. I think it'll be running within the next couple of weeks on Alan Haber's Pure Pop Radio.
Okay, and
wow.
Ken, what you got going on?
My Facebook page is Ken Michaels. You got to look for the photo with me, my wife, son, and Todd Rundgren. That'd be me. My email address is everylittlething@att.net, and my website is kenmichaelsradio.com. Always go to the website for weekly Beatles trivia, your chance to win one of 9 incredible prizes every week, and lots of great interviews.
Okay, and you can reach me on Facebook at either Alan Kozin or Alan Kozin Remixed, my alter ego. And for the rest of the guys here at Things We Said Today, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.